everyone, and welcome to The X, a podcast from inside Silicon Valley about how experience shapes everything, from products to businesses to entire industries. I'm Brian McLean, and I'm here with Demetrius Madrigal. Today, we're going to talk about a few huge topics: Amazon attempting to purchase One Medical and the potential passing of the CHiPS Act. Good morning, D. How you doing? How you feeling?
I'm doing all right. Now, these two topics, there are other things we could have talked about, including everything that came out of Comic-Con, but these two occurrences are potentially just gigantic. So I think it's good that we're going to focus on them and what their implications are.
Yeah, I think the Amazon one is a lot bigger than people anticipate. I haven't heard a lot of people jump in and talk about this potential Amazon deal in the way that I'm actually thinking about it, in the way you're thinking about it. I think it's huge. I think the medical industry is just decent in some places, terrible in others. I think it's not the experience I think that people are used to. You know, it's not the beautiful smartphone experience you have in your pocket. It's not the amazing experience you get with Amazon Prime delivery. It's a patchy at best experience that frustrates a lot of people and is ripe for innovation. And I mean, even today, you reached out to me and said, I had a medical thing procedure done and I got some massive bill for it and it was supposed to be covered. Like, why would you even get a bill for it? Why does it even have to stress you out? Why isn't this all done in the back end? You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's definitely, there are significant inefficiencies in there. There are potential elements of fraud where people are just saying, like, okay, well, I'm legally required to pay for this, but I'm not gonna. And because I don't think that my customer base is aware that of the law. And at the same time, on the pharmaceutical side, it just seems like massive price fixing, and it's all built around a system that is seems to be designed to try to make very wealthy people immortal rather than maintaining the health of all of society.
So let's talk about what is actually happening. Amazon has made the offer and it was accepted to purchase One Medical for $4 billion. Now, the reason why I say make the offer is because it has to go through a regulatory review and things like that. So it hasn't closed yet, but it looks like Amazon is going to purchase One Medical for $4 billion. When Amazon was interviewed about this, and we picked this up from The Verge, I think it was, the article that we saw here. It was on NPR, actually. Neil Lindsay, the senior vice president of Amazon Health Services, said, "We think healthcare is high on the list of experiences that need reinvention." I would agree with that. This is one of those areas that's totally ripe for it. And it's kind of the next $1 trillion opportunity for Amazon. Now, Amazon has already been in the medical space, as we all know. So they purchased PillPack in 2020, and that's basically to enhance their delivery of medications to individuals who need them, with the goal of cutting out the middleman a little bit, reducing the costs of the medications themselves, and also using that delivery method with Amazon Prime that we all have who subscribe to the Amazon Prime service. It's kind of the same thing that Mark Cuban is doing with his company right now, where he's cutting out the middleman and trying to give everybody a super, super, super reduced price for their medications, basically buying directly
Mhm.
from the manufacturer of the medications themselves.
Yeah, and for anyone who's not familiar with One Medical, they're a company that was started in San Francisco and kind of expanded through California and then outwards from California to other states. But they're basically a little bit more technologically enabled medical provider. So they actually operate clinics and they are membership based. So if you become a member of One Medical, then you become in their network, and they were some of the early adopters of things like apps and other information technologies in order to kind of modernize medicine.
Yeah, and I've actually known quite a few people who have One Medical. It was provided by the company that they work for, and they love it. I mean, it's primarily for the normal stuff, basic stuff, like
Yeah.
going to your doctor when you have the flu or you feel sick or that kind of stuff. But they said, like, you just bring up your app, you can push a button instantly, almost instantly you can be on a call with a nurse or a doctor. You can use text messages. There's like varying forms of communication you can use. They have these facilities that are very pretty and clean, and the whole experience has basically been reimagined. So a lot of people like it. And I think me see here what my numbers are. Membership for One Medical is around 767,000 members with over 200 locations. And they want to basically build an experience that's far superior to the medical setup now. I mean, the medical setup now, let's be honest, right, is you go to this facility or this hospital, you get checked in, you sit around, you wait, and then you talk to a nurse, and then somewhere in the back office somewhere, a doctor comes in, and then you talk to the doctor, you tell them what's going on, they're in and out within 5 minutes, unless it's something major, provide a prescription or whatever it is. Then you exit this situation, and then you get bills or other things, that are coming your way, depending on whether or not you have insurance or not. One of the things that I've gotten feedback on from friends, and I definitely suffer with a little bit of anxiety when it comes to going to the doctor and that kind of stuff, is
Mm-hmm.
the experience of like going into like a hospital or places like that where you're sitting, you're waiting, or anticipating versus walking to a very comfortable, beautiful, nicely set up place where everyone's greeting you, chatting with you, having kind of like a more comfortable friendship like dialogue seems like a better choice for at least people like me. And I think a lot of people would love to have that experience. Like, oh, I have to run to the doctor instead of like, oh no, I have to go to the doctor. Right. So I think there's a big opportunity here, and Amazon loves reimagining experiences. So, right. So this makes a
Mm-hmm.
lot of sense for them.
Well, this is kind of how capitalism is supposed to work, right? You have a high margin, consistent demand kind of industry. You're supposed to have more people entering into that provided services in order to drive costs down. And a lot of people will say that regulation has kept people out of this area, and that there's an element of truth to that. But there's also has been kind of an element of gatekeeping as far as some of these industries. It's kind of like, we were talking about this earlier. It's kind of like how the telecoms. If you are a company like Google or Alphabet and you're trying to get into becoming a telecom with Google Fiber, you might have to deal with a bunch of lawsuits from companies like Comcast in order to
Yeah.
prevent you from providing services. I feel like the medical industry is kind of in the same way, especially in pharmaceuticals. So you look at insulin, and insulin was something that was invented a long time ago and was never licensed. It was like there was a patent for it, and the creator made the patent open for everybody so that lives could be saved. And somehow the pharmaceutical companies have found ways in order to through essentially through price fixing to jack up the price of insulin without any kind of associated improvement in the insulin itself. So
Yeah.
getting more competitors in here, whether it's Mark Cuban, whether it's Amazon, whether it's somebody else, is ultimately likely to be a good thing for consumers, and hopefully we'll see more people entering to this and more people competing to help drive prices down.
Yeah, and if you actually look at the kind of Amazon setup, for example, right? Like they kind of already know a lot about you, right? I know some people are concerned about that, and when this
Mhm.
came up, a lot of people were concerned of like, oh man, they're going to know so much about me. Like, they listen to me, I buy all my groceries from them, like they know my whole life cycle. But let's take that out of the equation for a second and just think about the fact that when you're a Prime member, let's say, for example, One Medical was given to you as part of Prime. So now you have the opportunity to buy a bunch of, healthy foods and good things from the stores that they have, which are, Whole Foods and Amazon on food stores. Then you have your One Medical subscription. So you have the opportunity to reach out to doctors and nurses and get the things that you need in the way that you want to get them. Then you
Mhm.
have this delivery method, right, through Amazon Prime where you can get things same day, one day, and seems like at a max now 3 days.
Mhm.
You're basically creating this like really comfortable, safe, and opportunistic experience where if something does come up, you can get the care that you need very quickly and easily in the way that
Yeah.
you're accustomed to and comfortable to. To me, it sounds like a no-brainer for Amazon.
Yeah, and one of the really interesting things for me is Amazon's capability when it comes to logistics. That's ultimately their superpower, right?
Oh
They
yeah. Oh
manage
yeah.
logistics better than anyone, and bringing that level of capability to the medical industry, ideally, even if it's there are definitely pluses and minuses to this. But one of the big pluses is the medical industry has been slow to adopt information technology, slow to adopt efficient logistics. They haven't really needed to from an economic perspective because they make money no matter what, because you have to pay them or you die. So there's a certain amount of what's called demand elasticity or an inelasticity, in which no matter what the price is, you're going to pay it because it's potentially worth your life.
Yeah.
So without that pressure to innovate and improve and evolve, they've been slow to do so. And certainly some regulations involved in that, but there's plenty of other industries with plenty of regulation that have evolved. Now, what I'm hoping happens is, even if you don't want to sign over your medical care to Amazon as a company, or One
Uh-huh.
Medical by extension, then they will set the bar, kind of like Apple does with the experience with like consumer electronics devices, and then other people will have to keep up with them.
Hmm.
That's already happened a little bit with One Medical when they started using apps and online resources more. It kind of pushed other providers to do the same, and people have started to catch up. So if Amazon can take that to the next level with their kind of philosophy of logistics, their capabilities, and just their resources, then hopefully Kaiser and Sutter and all the others will do the same.
Yeah, and to be fair, I've actually felt like, Sutter and some of those others have really leveled up a lot over the years,
Hmm.
including Walgreens and CVS. Like I was in
Yes.
CVS the other day and I saw that they have the Minute Clinic set up. And what's really nice is that it's all open and out, kind of like out in the open. So you could just sit there and chat with somebody. And then when you have to have a procedure done, you kind of go into this little room in the back, but it's all lit up. They have a lot of diagnostic stuff out in the open that you can just use while you're sitting there, while you're waiting for medication, that kind of stuff. They've really dedicated themselves to building a situation that can handle like 90% of the issues you run across that are very basic. And so
Yeah.
this is their competition, right?
So
One Medical's competition basically is like the Minute Clinic.
yeah, let me ask you a question. So using the Minute Clinic, what was your you use their mobile app or their web experience?
I did not actually.
Okay.
I went to the Minute Clinic to get a flu shot a while back, and I just walked up, and they had this big, huge flat screen on the wall, and you just
Mhm.
tap appointment, type in your name, and then you get put in a queue. And then I sat out there and like tested my blood pressure and did all these fun things because they had a couple things that you can play with.
Yeah.
And then they call my name, and then I went in, I got my flu shot, and went home. But I didn't have to go down to the hospital. That's linked to my doctor's office, right? So I
Yeah.
felt better just going to CVS and doing that than going to the actual hospital and going through all the procedures of getting into the hospital and taking care of it.
Yeah, I've had a relatively positive experience with Minute Clinic. I had to do like a COVID test, like a PCR test, in order
Uh huh.
for kind of the medical screening thing that I did, just because they want to make sure they're not exposing their staff to COVID. And they have definitely improved. The app has improved, but the app still feels like it's maybe 2015 or
Oh,
maybe
okay.
2012. Like
Yeah.
it's there and it's an improvement, but there was a lack of transparency as far as status that
Uh huh.
you it definitely felt like you were waiting for somebody to manually reach out to you and provide an information update. So they've come along, but there's still room for improvement. And comparing that to like a full blown like tech company level of organization and kind of logistics management, it's not quite there yet. And I'm hoping that with people like Mark Cuban and Amazon getting involved, that maybe other people will get involved, and the companies that are already involved will step up as far as their service delivery and organization. Maybe that'll lower costs for them ultimately because they're more organized, and hopefully that means less cost moved on to the consumer, because it feels as though the margins are like luxury products within medical.
Hmm. Yeah, which is a major problem because ultimately, when
Yeah.
it comes down to it, and I'm sure you would agree with me, when push comes to shove and it has to do with the health of yourself or your family
Hmm.
members or your friends, you will spend whatever it takes to ensure that they're taken care of. And that's human and behavioral and basically using that experience as a way of saying, okay, well, if you're willing to pay $500 for this procedure, then I'm going to charge you $500 for this procedure. But it's kind of the wrong
Yeah.
thing to do, right? Because ultimately, like you said on a couple podcasts back, I think we were talking about, the economy and that kind of stuff, is that, a lot of people are one major health scare away from going bankrupt, right?
Yes.
Because the costs of all these things, right? So hopefully all of this innovation kind of coming into the space is going to really shake things up. I mean, I think about somebody who is diabetic, for example, and let's say they're part of One Medical and One Medical is part of Amazon, and they say, oh, by the way, here's your cost for insulin. We'll have it delivered to your house on a regular schedule. We know your schedule, all that stuff squared away. And then right after that, it says, by the way, here's a 20% discount for these foods that are great for people who are diabetic over at Whole Foods. Would you like me to order those for you and have them sent to your house? I mean, it's going to be a smooth experience like that at some point, right?
Yeah.
It's
And
it's
it's
going
to
to
their
get to the
benefit
point.
to do so.
Yeah. Like, oh, your dietitian recommended all these foods. We have them all available. We'll have them delivered to your house. They'll be there in 3 hours by the time you get home from work or something. It's like
Yeah.
it's right around the corner. So I'm excited about it, to be honest.
Yeah, and ideally it'll increase access. It will decrease costs. We've known since at least the early '90s that people getting in and getting routine screening on a regular basis decreases the cost. It catches illnesses early when they're more treatable, when it costs less to treat them, and when it involves less impact as far as the availability of medical care. And when people are being charged thousands of dollars for routine screening, it discourages them from going and getting the routine screening. So by
Absolutely.
by doing so, that's the whole idea behind the Obamacare and Romney Care before that. It's not act as though it's strictly a Democratic idea. This is known. This is known across the board. It shouldn't be political, and by doing so, it's going to help everybody out. So if we can get that figured out through a network of providers that potentially are working together, hopefully, then we can really help people out.
Yeah. How do you think all these devices tie into this? Like, for example, you could tell that Apple is continuing to push on the medical side with their Apple Watch, for example, right? They're looking at
Mhm.
heart arrhythmias and blood pressure and like, it's analyzing your sweat or like, these interstitial needles for diabetics that connect to your iPhone or your smartphones, that you've been talking about for like 10 years, when they first started
Yeah.
researching this area. How do you think all of that is going to play into some of these subscription services, potential subscription services like One Medical, Amazon delivery? Do you think it'll have like this nice seamless tie-in that, you go to One Medical and all your information that is on your watch is constantly on there so they can have a good diagnostic understanding of you over time and stuff like that? Do you think it'll be that smooth?
No, I don't think it'll be that smooth, and I don't know that it should be completely automated as far as sending things over. Maybe unless it's somebody who is much older and experiencing multiple simultaneous health issues, like somebody who's has difficulty managing the technology on their own. For someone like in our age group, we're in our early 40s, someone who's in our age group or younger, it might be more like, hey, I'm experiencing these symptoms. Let me send over the data relevant to those symptoms alone so
Yeah.
that you can see them. It's kind of like when my cat had a limp last year. So the doctor asked me, or the vet asked me to get a video of him limping. So we got the video and sent it over, and it helped them. It could be something like that, like, oh, I'm feeling some chest pain, so we're going to send over some wearable gathered heart information, some EEG stuff,
Uh-huh.
and that will help them by looking at it and saying, okay, let's make sense of this. But I think it's going to be focused around kind of like a need based situational use case rather than
Yeah.
like just the fire hose being sent over. Because on the other side, unless you are extremely advanced when it comes to being like a organization that can handle information and make sense of it,
Yeah.
just getting the fire hose isn't going to be very helpful.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's pretty exciting though that all of these things exist. I mean, I'm going to give you one example here that always kind of drives me crazy is that like whenever I go to the doctor, and part of it could be the fact that I have a little anxiety when I go, but like when I go to the doctor, my blood pressure is always high. But then
Yeah,
I have a blood pressure
that's normal.
monitor here at the house, and it's always normal.
Hmm.
So I've always thought to myself, like, I understand that they test your blood pressure when you're there, probably to find out if something maybe major is going on in the moment or something like that. But the real read should be, oh, when Brian's at home, it's always this particular number. And the only way for me to give them that number is I have to log into the app and then I have to type in the date and put it in and say, yep, it was high at the doctor's office, but I just want to let you know I came home, I sat on the bed, and here's what it is. And to me, that's a little bit of a clunky experience. I feel like,
Well, almost everybody I've known, you and I know what is involved in interpreting data, and part of that is understanding the conditions under which it was received, right? Like
yep,
if we did something about like, all right, well, let's evaluate like Bitcoin sentiment right after a major like a happening, then it's going to be low. It might be artificially
true.
low, or it might be like during a bull run, it's going to be artificially high. So you have to take that into account. Most of the best medical professionals that I've known have, when they're interpreting the data around blood pressure and stuff, take into account like, okay, well, you're stressed, you're at the doctor, blah blah blah. So they know that it's going to be a little bit elevated, I think, or at least the good ones. And but at the same time, you're when it comes to blood pressure, you kind of are a little bit more interested in it when it is elevated, because that is you're gonna encounter those situations in life where you're stressed, where
Yep.
where you ran. And what they want to know, I imagine, I'm not a medical professional, but what I imagine what they want to know is when it spikes, how high does it spike? Because that's when
Yeah.
issues can happen, right? That's when your blood pressure has its swings. How far does it swing? Now,
Yeah.
if they have the data that like, okay, you just ran, then they interpret it that way. And usually for me, if my blood pressure is a little bit high when I first get in, because it's normal for people to be stressed when they go in and get their blood pressure taken,
Yep.
and then they'll wait a few minutes and do it again, because like, oh, you're probably just a little high right now. Especially if you're in there because you're sick and you're like, oh, I'm
Yeah.
worried this could be COVID or something else. Then they're like,
Yep.
oh, well, you're anxious too. So that's all tied up in it. And I also know for you, a little peek behind the mirror for people out there, you're used to being kind of athletic, and I think that to some extent, when you go and get your checkups and stuff, there's a little bit of like almost competition with yourself of like, let's see where I can get these numbers.
Well, it's true actually, because the doctor did ask me at one point. He's like, are you trying to compete with yourself to find out how low you can get all these numbers?" And I was like, "Yeah, a little bit." And he's like, "You need to stop doing that. That's what creates anxiety. Is you're looking at this going like, oh, I want to win. I want to get like all these numbers on the perfect range of like, whatever it is, like best or whatever." And it's
Yeah.
like, he's like, that's what's creating the anxiety. And it's
Which
true.
it also speaks to potential gamification, right? When it comes to like, all right, well, let's try to get your blood pressure into a normal range, or your cholesterol or something like that. There's potentially an element of gamification that's enabled by these wearables, where people can say, okay, well, let's try to do this, and if you do well, then you get some kind of virtual or real reward
Hmm.
that continues to move you along.
Well, it kind of shows that there's natural gamification in certain personalities, right? So like even if it didn't
For sure.
exist, you might go in there saying like, well, last time my LDL levels or whatever were at X, and I want to see if they're better this time because I cut out something that I was eating or whatever. It's like you created your own game, and so you're making an interesting point here, because if you wear these wearables constantly, you could be feeding into a system of creating anxiety around,
Could be.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
But I mean, not everybody feels anxiety around games. It's just the most competitive people, I
yeah, that's true.
would say. Just like, oh no. Those are the people who end up becoming like, athletes on TV and Olympics and stuff like that. But yeah, a lot of people, like, when it comes to games and stuff, I don't feel anxiety
Yeah,
usually.
that's true. So it's supposed to be relaxing. It's supposed to be fun, right?
Yeah.
Um, well, hey, that's that's interesting, and I feel like this is kind of the new beginning a little bit. Like we've been talking about this for a really long time, but the fact that some of these acquisitions are happening now, and we're starting to see like more of this data being integrated properly and that kind of stuff, I feel like we're in the beginning of a new phase of medical. I had heard that a lot of clinical trials and things like that are going into their was it third phase or whatever it's called, right? For these cancer vaccines, all that kind of stuff are all happening in the next 2 years. And so it's like, wow, there's like a lot of medical innovation and development happening right now. Not that it doesn't always happen, but right now it seems like it's kind of peaking, or the ball is starting to get pushed over the edge. So I'm really excited to see what happens. I think it can help a lot of people, and hopefully it heads in a very positive direction. So let's talk about the second final topic today, because these were two big topics. And I'll have you jump in and talk about this a little bit, Dee, to start out. But the CHiPS Act, which it's really, really big. So the Senate basically voted 64 to 34 to advance debate on the CHIPS Act, a bill that earmarks $52 billion in incentives for chip makers to build plants in the United States.
Yeah, so
So
this
thoughts on that?
this act I think is huge. So basically, the situation that we've been in over the past couple decades essentially was originally semiconductors that were used to develop microprocessors that go into computers and consumer electronic devices, and now cars and medical devices and everything else were they were created here, in not just in the United States, but specifically here in Silicon Valley. Like my aunt worked for Fairchild and National Semiconductor back in the 70s and 80s. So, like, this is the originating point. And over time, what happened was that things started moving overseas because it is it is a resource intensive process that requires clean rooms and plenty of water, but not too humid an environment. So it's a little tricky, right? And when water became less available in California, it's one of the reasons why it ended up being moved more into other countries. But over time, it consolidated into essentially just a couple companies producing semiconductors. One of them being TSMC, I think that's Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company,
Uh huh.
and I believe Samsung. And there might be a few other ones also, but for the most part, those are the ones. And those companies are located in a few countries in Taiwan, China, South Korea, places like that, but not a lot in United States. So and China has invested $150 billion in public funds into increasing their chip manufacturing capabilities. And then Apple and Google and Nvidia and everybody else, they just order all of their silicon, their semiconductors from those companies, and then built to their specifications, including Qualcomm. And then they finish it within their own facilities and send them out as products. So this CHIPS Act will devote $52 billion in incentives for chip makers to build plants in the United States. So that has already been started. It started, I believe, even before the pandemic, because when a lot of these facilities shut down around the world, that's how we ended up with the silicon shortage. And demand has been super high because there's more the chips are going into more and more products. They're going into cars, they're going into medical devices, they're going into drones and cameras, and a lot of things that used to be strictly mechanical are being software enabled, and that requires processors. So with this, that means that more fabs will be built on U.S. soil, which has a huge impact on on all of us for a variety of reasons. Not the least of that is actually national security, because microprocessors are needed for almost everything that's done with the military. It's ground and aerial vehicles, drones, communications, coordination. There are some like handheld weapons that have microprocessors involved now.
Mm-hmm.
There's a variety of things that are involved for just national security, and not to mention energy and agriculture sections, like all of the wind turbines and geothermal. A lot of different types of energy plants are dependent on microprocessors in order to function.
So are we basically saying we're just going to invest in the existing chip makers, or will some of this stuff you think get divvied out to new chip makers, like smaller companies, that are emerging or working on new technology that hasn't been fully tested and vetted yet? You know what I mean? More
Yeah.
innovative.
Well, the idea is that it would go to anybody who's building fabs on U.S. soil. So it
Okay.
will help to fund the production of that. So Intel's set to potentially get 30 million or $30 billion because they're committing to building fabs. There might be other companies that do so. So far, NVIDIA and AMD, who are Intel's competitors,
Hmm.
haven't done so. Same thing with Apple or Google. They're still, I believe, mostly going through Samsung and TSMC, but others could do so. And I believe Samsung's actually building a facility in the U.S. I'm not entirely sure about that, but
I heard that they
with
were, yeah.
the yeah, with COVID and the lockdowns in China, the semiconductor shortage, a lot of companies have already jumped in and they've been looking at facilities, I believe, like Arizona, I think is might be getting some.
That's great. I mean, I look at this and I go,
Texas.
okay, where the rubber meets the road is whether or not we're going to be able to provide competitive pricing, right? I mean, we can mandate and say like, oh, if it's a product that's, has national security concerns, you know what I mean, that the chips have to be made in the United States. You could do stuff like that, but it'll drive up the cost of the devices themselves if we don't figure out how to make sure that the pricing is comparable to what they're getting in China right now. If it's a little bit more, I could see it not being a problem, but like if it's a lot more, that's where I think the issues could creep in, right?
Ideally, this should balance out the cost when it comes to for like normal tech, like consumer electronic stuff. This should balance out costs. It should stabilize supply. Should mean that that PlayStation 5 that you're looking to buy is going to cost like $1,000 when the MSRP is $500.
Yeah.
So it should help with that. On the other side of things, it does kind of represent it's a partial solution. Like $50 billion is probably not enough when China is spending $150 billion
Yep.
in tax money, and because China and Chinese companies ultimately control most of the rare earth elements on the earth. So these are minerals and metals that are used to make semiconductors. A lot
Uh-huh.
of them are in complex geopolitical areas such as Afghanistan or the Congo and places like that. And China has made major inroads, especially in Africa, in order to secure supply of these rare earth elements.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons why I think that both Blue Origin and SpaceX are really interested in getting to space, because if you can get onto some of these asteroids that are moving around in space, there's potentially massive amounts of rare earth elements on there with no regulatory control.
Did you just say that we're going to try to land on an asteroid and start digging out the rare earth elements?
Yes, this has been known
didn't
for
didn't
quite a
I see?
while.
I know, but didn't I see this movie D in the '90s? Right? Didn't this happen in the '90s? What was it
Kinda,
called?
yeah. Hopefully, there'll be less deaths involved and fewer nukes for sure.
Yeah. No,
But
but
yeah,
I think something like that is totally possible, especially now when you look at the space programs, from private sectors and things like that, where they're focusing on like being able to land rockets and on moving objects and things like that. It's totally possible. Also, you wouldn't send a human up there. You know what I mean? You send a robot to mine something
yeah,
and then come back. So yeah, I could see things like that happening. I mean, it'd be crazy, crazy to watch. But yeah, I like the idea of this. I think it's kind of cool that we can at this time when everyone's going cheap, 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 got to get stuff cheaper, 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 that we can take a moment and say, wait a minute, cheaper isn't the only thing. Like national security matters and things like that. And to build these plants, I mean, I think of like gigafactory type plants around the United States that are focusing on all of these different chips and technology components like this. I mean, that would be amazing. And how many jobs? Oh my gosh,
yeah,
thousands and hundreds of thousands of jobs if we do it right, right? Um,
yeah, and it could potentially be a lot of jobs in areas that aren't like Silicon Valley, where you ultimately have more jobs than you have people, right? So you can start to like it's kind of like with food, with jobs to a certain extent. The problem is less the amount of jobs available, especially right now, and the distribution of it. So if you can get more jobs, like I'm looking at this list, Texas Instruments, for example, has a bunch of facilities throughout Texas, in Sherman, Texas, in Dallas, in Richardson, Texas. I believe somebody was building facilities in Arizona. It was that Intel was built. Yeah, Chandler, Arizona, for Intel and things like that. Those are all more jobs that can go to places that don't have the kind of labor shortages currently in we have in California and Silicon Valley. So
Yeah.
that's good across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, this is exciting news. I mean, I love hearing like positive stuff like this because it, at a time when we're kind of going like, what's going on with the economy and how are things unfolding and that kind of stuff, to hear like these positive investments in the government kind of putting their foot down and saying like, yeah, we're going to commit to making this work. And I can imagine them only giving 54 billion now because you want to get this process rolling. And then once we need more, we do more and ultimately invest back into our country the way that
Yeah.
all of us kind of grew up hearing about some of these things, right? That happened, especially with the automotive industry and stuff like that. So this is exciting. Any other details that we should share about this?
Well, we will see. Keep in mind that this is also involving a lot of fundamental service industry, or not just service industries, but just transportation, agriculture, just like foundational industries. That's finance. Obviously, finance is heavily dependent on microprocessors. And
Hmm.
I think to a certain extent, people looked at this and said, what if China took over Taiwan and controlled that supply and said, okay, now we're going to attack a, because we've cornered the market, we're going to attack a massive 300% tariff on semiconductors entering the
Yeah.
United States.
Yeah.
Or if they just barred exporting to the United States in general, right? So it's a huge weakness in the supply chain.
Hmm.
And by doing that, corrects it. So, reading the tea leaves, they voted in the Senate 64-34 to advance debate. That tells me, if I'm reading this correctly, that it's going to pass. And it means potentially money going into factories in red states for materials that will then flow into blue states like
Yep.
California and Seattle, or that's not a state, and Washington. Um, so I think across the board, this is one of those rare things that everybody can get behind.
Yeah, I love it. Everyone working together again on a bigger goal. Ultimately, that's what it kind of comes down to, right? You have to set a big
Mhm.
goal, and everyone's got to be contributing to it and feel like they're also benefiting from it. So this feels like a natural transition. I did hear they were going to try to pass this actually before the August recess for Congress.
Yeah,
So if that's possible, that means that it could happen in the next couple of weeks, and we
yeah,
will talk about it when it does. So
yeah. I believe that Biden's been asking for it to be put on his desk. They've apparently got 64 votes in the Senate or close to it, and Pelosi has said that they have the votes in the House for it to pass. Also,
that's great news. Great news. All right. Well, I think that's a wrap for today. These are two big topics and super interesting. So, thank you for the information. Also, thank you all so much for taking the time to listen to us. We really appreciate it. We'll post those links on Twitter, like we always say, at the X Podcast One. That's the X Podcast number one. If you like this podcast and found it interesting or informative, helps us a great deal if you subscribe or leave a review on whatever platform you use. Thank you again, and we will see you all next week. Platform you